Hi everyone, I'm Mark Vasilyu. I'm the MLA for Fort Garry, and welcome to our 10th episode on the Ledge podcast. This is the podcast dedicated to all things provincial politics. We're back at the Ledge, and it's toxic and dysfunctional as always. Heat's been turned up because of the Nahanni Fontaine affair, and we'll get into the latest developments, and how Premier Kinew has reacted to tough questions being asked about him in the House. Spoiler alert, it hasn't been good. And we then get into the 2-year anniversary of the Kinew government and provide a scorecard of just how well this government is doing. And finally, the Kinew government is in a desperate attempt to look like they're doing something on addictions crisis, and they have introduced Bill 48. This is the expansion of the Intoxicated Persons Act. This is where the government can hold a Manitoban in custody for what they're now wanting to do, 72 hours, when they haven't been criminally charged or have done anything wrong. We'll talk about systemic racism, and we'll talk about how this type of legislation has a real racist impact on our laws. So lots to cover. Let's get into it. Now, the fall session started up again at the beginning of October, and the big news was the official opposition calling for Minister of Families Nahanni Fontaine to resign. For those that don't know the backstory, this is after a number of controversial incidents over the summer months. It was revealed that Minister Fontaine was dismissing and demeaning to a ASL interpreter at a community graduation. Then it came out that she blocked APTN reporters from having access to her social media, and then it came out that she was blocking foster parents from emailing her office. And then it further came out she was demeaning and disrespectful to foster parents using racist language, calling them white saviors and colonizers. And then there was criticism of her calling out and belittling a constituent on social media who didn't agree with her, describing the person as a little man and that she didn't owe him any explanations, despite being a minister of the Crown and this guy's actual MLA. The latest controversy, and the biggest, was her minimizing the murder of controversial conservative and U.S. activist Charlie Kirk. So not only did the official opposition ask Minister Fontaine to be removed from cabinet, on the day that they were doing this, there was actually protests outside the legislature by just regular Manitobans who were so outraged with her behavior that they came to the Ledge demanding her dismissal. The PCs also tabled 450 emails that their office has received from people demanding her removal from cabinet. Now, the Premier's reaction during question period was telling. Not only did he once again stand by Nahanni Fontaine, claiming that he didn't believe in cancel culture, obviously something that most people would think would be taken with a grain of salt, given the fact that I've personally experienced being canceled by Kinew from the NDP caucus because I would stand up to him. Now, when Wab Kinew gets in the hot seat, when he's being asked tough accountability questions, there is very much a distinct pattern, and you saw it play out with how he was dealing with Abi Khan's, the official leader of the opposition, tough questions on Nahanni Fontaine and whether or not Premier was going to hold her accountable. So sort of step one in the Wab Kinew plan is to gaslight, to deflect, and to misdirect. In response to calls for Ms. Fontaine's removal, he tries to reframe the issue as him being the great protector of Indigenous women. And of course, given his allegations of domestic violence in the past, that's obviously a little rich. But he's asked about violent incidents involving young people and machetes. That's the start of the question. And here's Kinew's response. He says, why doesn't the opposition leader be outraged at the targeting of two of his colleagues, meaning Nahanni Fontaine and Bernadette Smith, both of whom have had their constituency offices vandalized? So that's where he goes with this. If you ask him a tough question, he turns around on you and say that somehow it's racist or inappropriate question, and you really should be asking about these poor victims in his cabinet. The second strategy he uses is he demeans. Psychologists call this narcissistic rage. He's unable to withstand criticism, so he attacks anybody who does, including media and including everyday Manitobans. Now, in response to Khan tabling 450 emails sent to the PC caucus from outraged individuals over the behavior of Nahanni Fontaine, and obviously seeking their dismissal. Kinew's response is that he's going to, and I quote, resist commenting on how he struggled to lift the binder. And so what happened in the ledge, you had Abi Khan having to hand over to the clerk this massive binder of emails, and it was kind of awkward. So right from the get-go, Kinew is making fun of Khan's appearance and how he awkwardly handed over this binder. But he's in fact actually attacking his manhood. He's calling him a weakling, and he's focusing on his awkward physical movements, not on the substance of what he's actually saying. So here's the pattern. He's belittling, he's demeaning, he's trying to make Khan feel small. And of course, this is the Premier of Manitoba doing this. And this is a terrible example of it, but he does this often, and Manitobans should be concerned about it, is that he didn't just leave that for professional politicians. He also turned on the group gathered outside the ledge protesting Nahanni Fontaine and her continued inclusion in cabinet. So Kinew addresses the protesters during question period. And again, this is a democratic right to protest. They're being peaceful. Nobody's critical of the fact that they're there or that they're protesting. But Kinew says this about them, and I quote, "To the goofballs out front, if you have an issue, you have an issue with me. I'm the one who decided to keep this minister at the cabinet table." Now, goof is prison slang for a sexual predator. It's really one of the worst things that you could call somebody in jail. It often leads to fights. Premier would know this. He would know that this slang is very offensive and is something that he shouldn't be engaged in. But people were shocked that the Premier would use such disrespectful and demeaning language about people peacefully and democratically protesting in front of the ledge. In fact, the next day he was on CBC radio, and they asked him whether he stood by his comments, inviting him, basically giving him an opportunity to apologize and to sort of back down. He didn't. He proudly stood by what he said. And this is the same Premier that says he wants to turn down the temperature and is lecturing the opposition leader to stop being divisive. So in the House, after he attacks peaceful protester and he demeans them, he then goes back to gaslighting. He claims that Khan is, and I quote, attacking Indigenous women sitting in the front row. And he's bravely calling this out, and he claims without evidence that recent incidents of vandalism at Minister Fontaine's and Minister Smith's office are gender-based violence and racially based. Now, keep in mind, two of these offices are in some of the most challenged criminal areas of the city that are struggling, and it's very common in both of these areas for commercial establishments to experience vandalism. No one has been arrested or caught. There's no evidence or information that they were specifically targeting politicians or women or Indigenous women politicians. And at this point, we don't have any of that information. But despite not having that information, this is the Premier who is weaponizing both gender and race and turning up the heat and making it very dismissive. It's very us versus them rhetoric. If you criticize Minister Fontaine, you therefore must be racist, you therefore must be sexist, because how could you possibly criticize one of his ministers? So, and that comes down to the third tactic, playing the victim. And basically, the Premier is saying, forget about what she's done, whether she's lost the trust of the people that she's supposed to serve. The fact of the matter is the opposition is targeting Fontaine instead of him. And he's the brave hero standing up for women in his caucus who, for some reason, haven't been allowed to do the media on this. Fontaine has yet to defend her behavior in a free-ranging media scrum, but it's okay for Kinew to stand in her place and to protect her. Obviously, this is a very sexist double standard. It's really over the top. And the Premier really, if he believes that he has a strong female presence in caucus and in the cabinet, let them speak for themselves, let them defend themselves, let them take accountability for their actions. But he doesn't do that, and he's never done that. And of course, he argues that Khan is pandering to his base and dividing Manitoba. But of course, Kinew is doing exactly that. He's not only made this issue about gender or race, he's weaponized both. And he's done it to deflect and avoid having to answer real accountability questions that are lacking here. And by concentrating on the fact that the minister is a victim anyone trying to hold her account is further victimizing her, and that becomes the problem, not the fact that the minister is calling people white saviors and blocking media and stakeholders from communicating with her or her office. So Kinew accused Abi Khan of standing up for Peter Nygard as well in question period, and characterized Mr. Nygard as the biggest creep in Manitoba history. And of course, Khan wasn't doing any of that. Kinew was gaslighting again and deflecting. And you see that when he's in trouble, he begins interjecting himself into the justice system. His prosecution's branch is currently prosecuting Peter Nygard. This matter is before the court. And the reason politicians are not supposed to comment on active court cases, it gives off the perception that Kinew is sending signals to prosecutors, judges, and other Manitobans in general about what outcome he wants. And when the government is responsible for organizing and administering justice, they have to stay out of it. They have to remain neutral. They have to let the justice system be independent, and it has to be free from political pressure. So when Kinew makes these offhand comments about a Manitoban who's currently before the courts, he is politicizing the court process, but is also undermining its legitimacy. He is basically saying that this isn't neutral, that the government's going to put their thumb on their scales, and it is a really, really dangerous idea for him to be doing this. This is one of the key pillars of our democracy, and we're certainly seeing that Kinew doesn't feel bound by it. He has never explained, despite everything that Minister Fontaine has done, how he could, and more importantly, how Manitobans can continue to have confidence in her acting as a minister. And to do that, to avoid having to answer those questions, he has acted in a nasty, mean-spirited, and disrespectful way. He's engaged in gaslighting, and he's weaponized both race and gender. At the end of the day, despite calling for the temperature to be brought down in Manitoba, he is the one with the match and the rhetorical kerosene. Now, there's a couple other side notes on the culture of the ledge that I want to point out. The media is starting to call out Wab Kinew on his bullying. We've seen some reporters push back at press conferences at Kinew's often aggressive and demeaning style when he doesn't want to ask tough questions. And instead of answering those questions, he calls out the journalists. He imparts motives on them. He says that they're biased. Very sort of Trump-like behavior. But even some of his more major fanboys in the media have begun to characterize Kinew's exchanges with the media publicly as being prickly. And I think that's a good thing. I think that will help bring some sort of accountability here. There's been also another strange incident that occurred over the summer months. Reveille, the Minister of Advanced Education, was missing from the legislature for almost all of this spring session, and it didn't go unnoticed. A Winnipeg Free Press reporter made repeated attempts to inquire about Cable's lengthy absence from the legislature, and the NDP comms team completely stonewalled, would not give an answer. And there was no public announcement of her not being at the job. In fact, it turned out that Minister Cable had a major health issue and was away on a health leave, and her duties were taken over by another minister. But there was no press release. There was no explanation at the time. And this was very strange. It's very different than what happened with the former Minister of Education, Nella Altamar. When he left for medical treatment, he announced publicly that he was going on leave. The government announced that that was happening and actually indicated who the replacement was at the time. Everything was above board. But this time with Mr. Cable, it wasn't. And this time with Mr. Cable, they took repeated hounding by a journalist to find out what was going on. And it took until the end of September, which was the first time the minister spoke. And it was only after the media basically had repeatedly been asking for 7 months, and, this is an illness that dates back to April, that they came out and said, yes, this was a health issue. Now, Manitobans understand politicians get sick. The actual details of what happened or what was wrong with him is really nobody's business. I don't think the government has any duty to tell you what the specifics are. But a very simple answer in April 2024 basically just says the minister is on sick leave. You don't have to get into any details. But what this story shows and what's concerning is how secretive and the lack of transparency of the Kinew government and how manipulative their media team is, that they wouldn't answer a very simple, straightforward, understandable question. And that's the culture that's been built in the Kinew government and is something that should concern all of us. Now, finally, I want to talk about another news story that broke this week that gives Manitobans sort of a glimpse into how the Kinew government thinks and works. In June, the Kinew government held a press conference and made a big deal about how Manitoba, for the first time in 20 years, gained more people from other provinces than it lost. Turns out that isn't true. In fact, Manitoba continued to lose people to other provinces, and the migration numbers were a blip. And when you looked at a longer period of time, it reverted back to what it's been like for the past 20 years, where Manitoba has more outmigration than immigration. And for a small province like Manitoba, this has become very symbolic of whether a government is doing enough to build the province and to keep young people here. The media had to correct the false story because when it first came out, the government had a big press conference and they were patting themselves on the back. And only after a few months later, it realized that the story was false and it had to be corrected in the media. But at the time that they corrected the story, they pointed out this hadn't been the first time that the Kinew government went out and made a big flashy announcement only for their facts to be wrong. And in fact, the opposite was true. When the Kinew government rolled out their homeowners' property tax reforms, they stood on a lawn in St. Vital and claimed that with their new education property tax reforms, that this homeowner would pay less under the Kinew government in education property tax than they would under the former PC government. Well, the problem is, with property taxes, homes have been exploding in value. And if your house goes up in value, you pay more tax. So the homes in the St. Vital neighborhood had gone up in value. And when the education property taxes were then calculated, these homeowners, in fact, were paying more in education property taxes than they would have under the PC plan. So the conclusion for all this is how performative and empty much of the Kinew government's press conferences are. And they're more interested in looking good than actually being good. There's no emphasis simply on governing. Kinew's time in office has been one big press conference, and no one seems to be sweating the details. Problem with that is that people need to trust their government. And, you do this enough, media and others are just going to start rolling their eyes when the government makes these announcements because they know that they haven't got their facts in order. But the government understands people's attention span is low. They live busy lives. No one's going to remember the details of any one of these press conferences. All they're trying to do is actually create sort of a vibe. And they may not be wrong about this, and that's concerning. So there's basically incentive to go out, make splashy announcements, even though the facts may be shifting under you. And of course, never ever correct yourself when you have to. So, and in the end, the government can still claim wins when Manitobans actually aren't seeing the benefit of good policy. All right, we've reached the halfway point of the Kinew government, and it's time to see how they're doing. The obvious and most important question is Wab Kinew's number one commitment was to fix healthcare. Arguably, this is the reason why he won the 2023 election and why the PCs were thrown out. But here's the thing. On each and every important health metric in the past 2 years, Manitoba is doing worse under Wab Kinew for healthcare than the previous government. Emergency wait times are worse now than when he took office in October 2023. Under Wab Kinew, 3 people have died sitting in an ER waiting room waiting to see a doctor. We have surgical wait times that are at an all-time high. MRI wait times are at an all-time high. The number of private agency nurses, something that Kinew government was railing against, is back and on the rise. And nurses, once an enthusiastic ally of the Kinew government, are bitterly disillusioned to the point where they're actually showing up in the hundreds to protest the Kinew government at the steps of the legislature. And it appears that there's simply no trust between the nurses and this government. And of course, Kinew has ignored safety concerns at hospital sites until they blew up into a full-on crisis. The nurses had to go to a very extreme step of gray listing Health Sciences Center, which basically means telling their nurses that the Health Sciences Center is not a safe place to work. Now, think about that for a minute. We're already in a nursing shortage at these institutions. Health Sciences Center needs to recruit more nurses. The government can't afford to further alienate the people that they need to work in the system. But, the nurses, when they came to the legislature and were protesting the Kinew government, basically were saying that when Wab Kinew says he's doing a listening government, that's not true. That, in fact, the government hasn't been listening to them for 2 years. And in fact, more recently, they've had less and less contact with the government, and the government certainly isn't taking their concerns into account when creating government policy. Basically, they're calling out this government. They're saying that it's empty and it's performative, and it's one that clearly doesn't sweat the details. So healthcare has been a mess for some time. And in fairness to the Kinew government, nobody was expecting that the government was going to fix it overnight. But the issue here is that there's been no signs of progress at all. And there's been plenty of signs of backsliding. And of course, there's no acknowledgement by the Kinew government that this is in fact occurring. I mean, people will understand that this is a huge task. They will actually give the government some grace. But instead of explaining what the problem is, explaining what the backlogs are and what the issues are, the government gaslights Manitobans and tell them that everything is the previous government's fault. Well, after 2 years, that certainly rings hollow to Manitobans. So at a minimum, the government can set out a plan, explain why the progress is so slow, why things have actually gotten worse, what they're planning to do to address those issues, and what new resources are being dedicated to actually fund it, and how they're going to measure progress. If you do that, I think that'll give some Manitobans some hope, some faith, and some trust in the government. But this is a government that doesn't actually like to govern. Kinew, when he's not the center of attention at a press conference, is very much less interested in the mundane details of governing, and it's showing. You're not going to fix healthcare through press conferences. It is a grind, as the Premier would describe it, and it means actually governing. It means taking meeting after meeting and organizing government resources to identify problems and then finding solutions. None of that's glamorous. You don't get in front of cameras and media attention for doing it, but that's the job and that's how you do things. And one thing that we're not talking enough about in Manitoba is the Kinew government is underfunding healthcare, despite it being the largest expenditure of the provincial government. In 2015, under the previous NDP government, Manitoba spent third most per capita per person on healthcare in Canada. Under Kinew, we've fallen now to about the second worst in Canada. So the money that we've received over the last 10 years and extra transfer payments hasn't been going to build a better healthcare system, and that really hasn't changed under Kinew, although he has been putting some new money in, but it's clearly not enough given the lack of progress. Second sort of big promise when it comes to public health is ending chronic homelessness by their second term. Under Kinew, homelessness has actually doubled in the city of Winnipeg, but there's some progress here. They've settled on a strategy where they would provide more social housing along with what are called wraparound supports. That's counseling and other social work services to help address the complex needs of people who live with homelessness. And, there's some evidence that this strategy is actually, in fact, working. Problem is, it's expensive. There's not enough social housing units, and there's not enough staff to work in those units. So the pace of the program is negligently slow. In the year the program started, there's only been about 77 people who have been housed, although in fairness, most of them have remained in housing. And the reason for that is these wraparound supports. So you're addressing the needs of these individuals who obviously have some trouble being in stable situations. Now, the Kinew government's goal is only 700 people who live currently in encampments. Problem with that is that's not the homeless population. According to the Winnipeg Homeless Survey, there's actually about 2,500 people experiencing homelessness in the city. And if you talk to advocates that work in this space, they say that number is too low, that it represents a great deal number of people. It's more likely double. And of course, more people, as we know, under Kinew have become homeless by the day. So 700 is not a fixed number. That's the goal for the Kinew government. So basically what they're saying is they want to close encampments. They don't want to end homelessness. So they're kind of moving the goalposts already. And they don't certainly have a plan to house 2,500 people, let alone 5,000. And they certainly aren't building social housing at any kind of rate where you could actually even house the 700 people that you want to get out of the encampments. And that's if the 700 people stays 700. That number seems to be growing in Manitoba. So why isn't this going well? You have some early success. It looks like there's a formula here that works. The reality is that this government is underfunding this program. They're not putting in the resources needed to actually get the job done. Basically, this program has been set up to fail. Not enough social housing, not enough people employed. And the reality is the Kinew government is running an austerity government, very much like any other conservative government, and they're not funding social services at the rate that they need to be funded. And you see this in healthcare, you see this in education, you see this in childcare spaces, and now you see this in the homeless strategy. And Manitobans are losing faith. Probe Research did polling in September, and 50% of respondents said the Kinew government was doing a poor to fair job, not exactly a ringing endorsement of their approach. The other side of the coin here is the Kinew government promised to bring a safe consumption site to Manitoba in order to save lives. We lose about 500 people to overdoses every year, and the idea behind these sites is that a person may not be ready to detox and get clean, but you want them using in a safe, supervised area so that if they have an overdose, medical help is there and you can save their lives, keep them alive longer, and connect with them, build trust and community. And when they're ready to seek treatment, the resources are there and government can help. You got to keep people alive long enough so that they get to that point where they actually want to help. And obviously a worthy goal. We do need a safe consumption site. The problem is they had planned to put a safe consumption site in the Point Douglas neighborhood without actually talking to anybody who lives there. And the community pushed back. They didn't want some of the negative aspects of a safe consumption site that comes with it. And so the government basically broke their promise. They said they were going to open it up by, December of this year. They now said that that's not going to happen. And they're now moving the goalposts and they're saying that they're going to open up a safe consumption site before the next election 2 years from now. And of course, we're seeing the Kinew government do a 180 in this space, and now they're doubling down on criminalizing and stigmatizing homeless population. They're trying to bring in a law that would hold people in custody for up to 72 hours in some type of what we used to call drunk tanks if somebody was impaired by drugs or alcohol, despite these individuals having committed no crime. And it's one of these knee-jerk racist reactions that will disproportionately target the homeless community and marginalize Manitobans, who will be the ones who get picked up by the police and get forcibly held in these centers for 72 hours. And if you're held in these centers, there's very little difference between a drunk tank and a jail. They're basically the same thing, and you lose your liberty. The only difference is you have no rights to a lawyer in a drunk tank, and you haven't actually committed any crime. So healthcare is not going well, and this government certainly has been backtracking on some of their key initiatives. So that comes to the next big job of the provincial government, and that's the economy. And one of the major promises was Wab Kinew said he was going to balance the books by his first term. And again, we're halfway through. So Wab Kinew had promised he's going to balance the books by 2027. That's 2 more budgets. That's about 20 months of time. Now, in his first year of office, he overspent his budget by $500 million. Last year's budget, he overspent by $353 million. And in fact, that number doesn't even take into account what he actually really overspent. He received a $420 million windfall from a tobacco lawsuit. And if he didn't have that money, he would have overspent his budget again by $774 million, or $750 million. So if you get that, for 2 years in a row, he could not properly budget the province of Manitoba and was $500 million and then $750 million over what he said he was going to spend for that year. And It looks from the public accounts that next year, the government's on pace for an $890 million deficit. That's $96 million higher than the government was predicting. That means in 1 year's time, the province will have to find close to $1 billion in savings or new revenue to balance the books. Kinew has already said that he's not going to raise taxes, but that isn't exactly true. He isn't planning to raise taxes on the rich. And in fact, one of the reasons we're in this mess in Manitoba is he kept the Pallister government's tax cuts for the rich while at the same time raising taxes on middle-class Manitobans. He stopped indexing tax brackets for inflation. That hits directly middle-class families the most. He put a very low cap on the education property tax rebate. And with skyrocketing real estate prices, it meant that average middle-class homes saw a huge spike in property taxes. He's been underfunding universities, which means middle-class families saw a huge spike in post-secondary tuition costs for their children. He's been underfunding public education. And what happens when you do that? The schools start charging extra fees and extra costs, and all of a sudden, families have to come up with money for their children to go to a public school. He's also made this incredible claim that Manitoba will be a have province by 2040. That's 15 years from now. So right now, we're a have-not province. We get extra money from the federal government that makes us actually very much dependent on the federal government and how much money they send us for us to actually provide services here in Manitoba. But here's the thing. In 15 years, to get to the point where we're the ones who make more money and can transfer money to have-not provinces, in 2024, Manitoba lagged behind every other province in economic growth. The province announced an economic strategy. The big goal, of course, is becoming this have province. It's very symbolic for us here in Manitoba. But what the strategy entailed was a $50 million loan program that won't get us there, and some minor tweaks to some tax credits. So since Kinew became premier, Manitoba has rapidly grown with over 55,000 more people living here in the last 2 years. Despite that rapid growth, new jobs have been stagnant and the economy has stagnated under Kinew. There's actually no plan to grow the economy. So far, it's all just been performative. It's all been just talk. And classic Kinew, grab headlines, but not actually do anything. And of course, in 15 years, he's not going to be in power. And so it's a very easy promise to make. Most premiers get about 6 years in office before they face pressure to go, and this very much was more of a public relations exercise. But what is real is that under the Kinew government, Manitoba economy is underperforming. It's actually the worst in the country. And sort of the canary in the coal mine, Kinew government announced that for the first time in 20 years, they got all excited that Manitoba was going to get more interprovincial migration from other provinces than we lost. It's a very big symbolic thing for a small province like us that we're constantly losing our young people to other provinces. And they had a big press conference and they were bragging that, under Kinew, finally more young people are moving here than are leaving. Well, it turned out that wasn't true. We're continuing to lose people to other provinces, and it seems that under Kinew, Manitoba's greatest export is our talented young people. Kinew promised that Manitoba being a have province, the media has described that as completely detached from reality. The reality is the notion of being a have province is about being fiscally and financially independent and not reliant on the federal government. Under Kinew, Manitoba has become even more reliant than ever on the federal government and even more dependent on that level of government transferring money for us to organize our own affairs. So that now comes to the fact that we are in a cost of living crisis, and we have been for a couple of years. And quite frankly, the record under the Kinew government is not good. Manitobans are not better off under Kinew. And I'll start with shelter costs. In the past year, they have gone up 4.8%. Rents, despite being a rent-controlled jurisdiction, are growing faster here in Manitoba than the rest of the country. And keep in mind, 40% of Manitobans rent. This is affecting a lot of Manitobans. And the reason for rapid rent increases is that we have loopholes in our rental laws that allow large corporate landlords to get around the rental cap by applying for what they call an above guideline increase. And they have been year over year, some companies, and people are seeing year over year massive increase increases. Now, Kinew recognized the problem in opposition. He promised in opposition that he was going to close the loopholes. After 2 years, he has not advanced any legislation to do so. It's clear he is absolutely not committed to this, and that this is going to be a broken promise, and that he is throwing his hat in with the big corporate landlords. Then we got to talk about grocery store prices in Manitoba. We have the fastest growing prices in Canada, 2.6% last year. And of course, Kinew has done nothing to bring those prices down. Now, the one thing Manitoba has done for years is we regulate the price of milk, and that's the only commodity we do. It also happens to be the only commodity that hasn't skyrocketed in price due to inflation. The other thing that we could do is obviously expand that. We could add more grocery store staples and regulate them like we do milk. The sky hasn't fallen in by regulating milk, and in fact, Manitoba families have been able to get affordable, high-quality food, at least in the form of milk, from Manitoba producers. We could be expanding that program. We haven't. We could also open up government grocery stores on a nonprofit model to lower prices. We could certainly partner with Co-op Groceries, which is Manitoba member-owned, and extend their reach into the many food deserts across the province. Although they're very much a profit model, they return their profits to their members. Finally, we can cap and disallow predatory fees that large supermarket chains charge. So when you walk into a supermarket and you look at the large supermarkets and their shelves, those big supermarket chains charge companies to rent space to sell their products. And that costs money for the big food wholesalers, who then inflate the prices of their food, and you and me end up paying for those rental fees. Now, this is illegal in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, and Australia. They ban those type of fees, and groceries are much, much cheaper in those countries. Kinew government could ban them here, and it would be a noticeable difference in price. Ask yourself why he's not. In fact, Kinew will not take on the Walmarts of the world. He bragged that he's a proud shopper of this U.S.-based corporation. I certainly shop Canadian and support Canadian grocery stores, so I take a very different view than him. And then we come to transportation costs, and they went up 5.6% last year. Now, keep in mind, Kinew borrowed $340 million to give a 1-year gas tax holiday to Manitoba. Most of that money went to corporations, about 60%, and the rest to high-income earners. Most people were saving less than $14 a month on the gas tax. In the meantime, he put zero money into public transit. And public transit fees are skyrocketing. It costs you in Winnipeg about $6.70 for one return trip on the bus. Now, money spent subsidizing corporate tax bills could have paid for free transit for everyone for several years. And it just shows you where the Kinew government's priorities lie, and it's not with Manitoba families. Now, the key to all this is that inequality has gone up under Kinew. Manitoba is once again the child poverty capital of Canada. Kinew has never acknowledged that publicly. I don't even know if those words have left his mouth. It's clearly not a priority. He's put very little resources into poverty reduction. In fact, poverty is on the rise in Manitoba. Almost 12% of Manitobans, or 179,370 people, live below the poverty line. And Manitoba has the highest rate of people living in deep poverty, and that's defined as 75% below the poverty line. So 103,000 Manitobans live on less than $11,341 a year. Imagine living on $945 a month. Well, over 100,000 Manitobans are forced to do that. Kinew government has actively made things worse. He has frozen the EIA rates, which are the welfare rates. There's been no cost of living increase, and with inflation jumping in the last few years, a freeze on EIA rates is a cut. His much heralded school nutrition program, this is what he points to as, look, I'm a progressive politician. He isn't, but it's in its second year. He froze the funding after the first year, which means with skyrocketing food prices, he's actually cut his signature school nutrition program this year, and there's less resources going to the school nutrition program. It is not indexed for inflation, which means each and every year, it will be less and less money trying to feed Manitoba kids. It is no surprise that at the same time, food bank use in Manitoba has skyrocketed. Manitoba has the distinction of having the lowest rate of intergenerational income mobility in Canada. What that means is if you live in poverty in Manitoba, you're trapped. Your children have less of a chance of escaping poverty in Manitoba than anywhere else in the country. And there's a higher likelihood of that same child dying in poverty and passing on their poverty to their children. So it's not just very poor. People are getting worse off in Manitoba. We're talking about working people. Over 170,000 Manitobans earn less than a living wage. That's 25% of the workforce. It's overwhelmingly women. It's overwhelmingly newcomers, mothers with children under the age of 18. If you raise their income alone, you would go a long way to dealing with child poverty in Manitoba. Now, the living wage in Winnipeg is over $19 an hour, yet the minimum wage was just raised in October to $16 an hour. It is now the third lowest in Canada. Only Alberta and Saskatchewan have a lower minimum wage than Manitoba. And the increase, wait for it, is 1.1%. So think about how much shelter's gone up, how much food has gone up, how much transport's gone up. That 1.1% doesn't even come close. And keep in mind, Wab Kinew, as Premier Manitoba, received a cost of living increase this year. How much did he receive? 2.5%. So ask yourself why he deserves a cost of living increase more than double what Manitobans are getting under the minimum wage law. Again, working people and poor Manitobans are simply not on this government's radar. They don't count. They are very much being left behind. And this government is not prepared to tackle the cost of living crisis. So, after 2 years, all the major promises are in shambles. The cost of living crisis is unabated. There's growing inequality. There's a lack of job growth and economic development. On any objective level, Wab Kinew has been a disaster as a premier, and it is not too late for him to change course. But that would require him to start listening, start putting working families at the center of his agenda, and worrying less about his public image and press conferences and more about the actual details of governing. But if he doesn't, Manitoba, expect more of the same. Last week, the Kinew government announced Bill 48 in the fall sitting, and they've announced that they're going to try to speed passage through the legislature, which would require all MLAs to agree to its passage. He tells Manitoba that he is responding to the methamphetamine crisis here in Manitoba, and he wants to give more powers to the police to hold people who are intoxicated for longer than they currently allow. So this is under a current law called the Intoxicated Persons Detention Act. Now, the current law, police can hold someone in custody for up to 24 hours without their consent if they are intoxicated, and this is key, and they're in public. So you get no right to counsel. There's no right to review the police officer's decision whether you're even intoxicated, and the police get to decide who's intoxicated, and whoever is holding you in whatever detention facility gets to decide for how long and when they think you're sober enough to be released. Now, Kinew's logic for this is that at the time the Intoxicated Persons Detention Act was created, alcohol was the big intoxicant of choice. He now argues that Manitobans are dealing with methamphetamines, that they have a longer period of intoxication. The side effects can be erratic or unpredictable behavior, but not always. He reasons that we need to keep people in custody longer, and I can't stress this enough, who haven't committed a crime and can't be charged criminally with anything. And keep in mind, it's not a crime to be intoxicated in Canada. But taking people's liberty away when they haven't committed a crime, Kinew is telling us that's a good thing. And I'm going to quote him. This is to provide police and community workers more options to keep meth users and the public safe. He goes on to say, so that those folks can get help that they need, including health care, but also be prevented from doing violent things in the community. Leaving aside the fact that he is basically stigmatizing all people who get intoxicated as being violent, causing chaos and havoc. They're not, and many people are passive and peaceful when they're intoxicated. But the second part of this is deeply troubling. He's saying he's going to hold somebody who isn't criminally under suspicion for longer than you can hold somebody who is under criminal suspicion for their own benefit so that they can get help. leaving aside, first of all, that not everybody who gets intoxicated is an addict and needs help. They just might be having a bad night. But also, a key part of our Constitution, it is unconstitutional to force treatment on individuals in Canada without your consent. And that's what this law is trying to do, is trying to force treatment on people when they haven't asked for it. They may not even need it. And it's an untrained police officer who's making that call. It assumes that everyone who is high is actually an addict. That's not true. And it also assumes that these people are in need of treatment, where it just simply logically is not the case. So in a democratic society, that should get everybody chills, that the government is going to detain you, hold you, and arrest you without charge for your own good because they think you have a health problem. It's also inconsistent with this government's approach to addictions and homelessness. Now, you remember Kinew's signature policy, although floundering, is opening up a safe consumption site. Now, the PCs are opposed to it. They're saying that it encourages drug use and that what government really should be doing is providing treatment options instead. And the Kinew government rightly counters. They say, well, you can't force people into treatment. You need to keep them alive until they're ready and waiting to be treated. And that's solid logic. It's evidence bears that out. Now, they want to do the exact opposite with this detention law by giving police and government more power to arrest people who've done nothing wrong and detain them in custody against their will in some futile hope that they're going to want treatment. So it's bizarre. It's gaslighting rationalization. It doesn't hold up, and it's completely inconsistent with what they're saying about safe consumption sites. Beyond that, forcing people into treatment doesn't work. If somebody doesn't consent to be treated, they're not going to do the work that they need to get healthy. You're basically wasting resources. People need to want to get clean, and you can't bully them into doing that. And that seems to be the whole rationale behind this law. The second reason this is so problematic is the real reason why we're having this law. This is a public relations exercise, and the public is fearful of methamphetamine users and homeless people, and those two things are being sort of conflated together. And Kinew is pandering to that fear. And that's what this is really about. He's prepared to sacrifice the liberty of Manitobans to assuage that fear, or at least to appear to be doing something about it. Now, again, homelessness has doubled under Kinew, and very little has been done to create a universal mental health system in Manitoba to address drug and alcohol addictions crisis. And Manitobans don't think this government is doing a great job. We have the probe poll from 2025 saying that over 50% of the population thinks that Kinew government has done a poor job. And so this bill is that reaction to that poll. This is a government, obviously, that's in over its head, and they've done less than the bare minimum. And so here comes the announcement, Bill 48. Now, Minister Smith, at the press conference discussing the bill, claims that this bill is meant to keep people safe, to empty out our ERs, and to connect people with care. But the clue as to what's motivating the government on this is that the police were at the press conference and were lauding having this extra power to hold people. The police currently have two choices, according to Minister Smith. They can either arrest somebody and criminalize them, which they don't want to do, or they can take them to a hospital and tie up a police unit, taking them off the streets for 10 hours. The problem with that is that's not the only choices. There's nothing in the current law that prevents them from using detention centers. The limits right now is just how long you can hold somebody there. So it's 24 hours now instead of 72. So the police right now have the choice that they could take somebody immediately to a sobering center, but are not. They're choosing to take them to a hospital and to be there for 10 hours. They're choosing not to arrest them if they had done something criminally. So they're making those choices now. And under the current law, they can use the current tools that they have. They don't need these 72 hours. So that is basically disingenuous, and it's a red herring. Now, keep this in mind, and this is the chilling part. If you arrest somebody in Canada, you can only hold them for 24 hours under suspicion without them seeing a magistrate. After 24 hours, they have to see a magistrate and be allowed to go for bail. Under Kinew's law, you have less protections when you haven't committed a crime than if you had. You will not be able to go see a judge within 24 hours, and you will not be able to get yourself released. You could be potentially held for 72 hours. So there's a lot of Orwellian doublespeak here, and it's chilling. Here's the issue with this law. It's unconstitutional. It arbitrarily detains people based on an officer's view of intoxication. They're not medically trained. They're not using breath test equipment or analyzing blood. Once they have you, how do they know the drugs or alcohol have waned off? There's no way for them to know, and so they keep you as long as they want to keep you. Similar laws that have been enacted in Canada have actually been struck down for violation of the Charter of Rights. There's no due process in these laws, which means that you have no right to appeal your detention. Once they take you into custody, you have no way to get yourself released earlier. You're completely at their discretion. Now, you can't say to the cops that they got it wrong. You can't appeal to a magistrate saying, hey, there was a mistake here. And intoxication isn't even defined in the Act. What does it mean? Does any alcohol or drugs in your system mean that you're intoxicated, or do you have to be grossly impaired that you can't walk or talk or look after yourself? And of course, what's critical here, if you were arrested, you'd immediately have the right to a lawyer. Under this law, you don't. So even though current law lets you sober up in a place, it also provides that if you can get some sober adult to come down, you can get released early. But how is your family and friends going to even know you're in a sobering center if you don't get a phone call, you're not allowed to call anybody, and you're just trapped in a sobering center? And there's nothing requiring the people holding you to get in touch with your family and friends to get you out of that situation. So the law prevents the police or the province also from getting sued for wrongly detaining you. So here the police can hold you, say you're intoxicated when you're not. They can hold you up to 72 hours without you getting to call your family to pick you up early, or calling a lawyer, or seeing a magistrate pleading your case that you've been wrongly held. And after being wrongly held for 72 hours, you can't even turn around and sue the government for the mistakes that they've made. I mean, this is a human rights crisis just waiting to happen. So basically, you're being taken against your will. It is a violent act by the police to hold you and transport you to the jail facility. And we know that it's not healthy to do this to people, and that people die in custody. And there's a long history of people dying in what we used to call drunk tanks. And this law applies throughout Manitoba in remote rural locations as well as the city of Winnipeg, which means the RCMP won't have a fully staffed, trained sobering center to take people. They're going to lock them up in whatever cell that they have, and they're going to leave them in there because they're not going to have the staff to evaluate. And we've already dealt with this in Manitoba, and there has been tragedy. CBC did a report in 2021 that there was 250 deaths in police custody over a 10-year period of time. 61 of those involved people who hadn't committed a crime at all, who were being detained due to public intoxication, and they were being held in RCMP cells. The RCMP held up to 16 people in one cell. That was their sobering center. People are sleeping on the floor. They're stripped down to one layer, and they're not, at the time that the report came out, there wasn't even a mat or a blanket, and they were just hurting people in there. Now, this law tries to address that you can only hold someone 72 hours if they go to what's called a protective care center. But if there's no protective care center that exists, and there's only going to be one in Winnipeg, then the law won't apply to you. And again, if this is about public safety, if what the government is saying is true, why is there only going to be one center in Winnipeg and this law won't apply to anywhere else in Manitoba? Even if they can add more protective care centers, there won't be enough, and they certainly can't be put in every small rural or First Nations detachment. So this is going to rule out massive parts of the province which have struggling methamphetamine crises that aren't going to have the resources, the staff, or these protective care centers. And it really shows you what this bill is about, that it's not really about protecting people. It's not really about saving lives. This is about appeasing the Winnipeg Police Service. It is about trying to show the Kinew government is actually doing something on addictions when they really are not. But it gets worse. Under the current law, a qualified health professional, which has not been defined, who they are, what their qualifications are, they are allowed to hold someone involuntarily for a psychiatric assessment under the Mental Health Act. And so you can actually hold somebody longer than 72 hours. And again, you've committed no crime, you've done nothing wrong. And this is a jail here. We're talking about a dehumanizing, humiliating treatment of Manitobans. You get frisked and your property gets taken away. You get put in a controlled setting and you basically get treated as a prisoner until you're being released. It's not like this is a country club. You're not watching movies until you sober up. And that brings me to the next point, why these laws are so insidious. This law will allow people who initially get booked in for 72 hours for one of these sobering centers, that if they think that there's a problem, they can actually apply under the Mental Health Act and hold you indefinitely until a doctor releases you, much longer than 72 hours. That is much harsher than the current law that doesn't give you that power. Here is why we have to raise the alarm in Manitoba, because we've seen a recognition in our justice system, including the Chief Justice of Manitoba, say that our Manitoba justice system is systemically racist. And what do they mean by that? They mean that the law isn't neutral, that it applies differently to different groups, and that it overly incarcerates and criminalizes Indigenous and BIPOC Manitobans. You look at our jail system, the Indigenous community makes up about 20% of the Manitoba population, but 80% of our jail system, and the Indigenous community is completely overrepresented in all facets of CFS and the criminal justice system. And it's because of certain laws. Certain laws only affect certain groups of people. The law is not neutral. It doesn't neutrally apply to everyone. And by virtue of your life circumstances, you may never encounter the police or be subjected to police exercising their discretion on your life. And that's true for most middle-class Manitobans. And here's the thing, most middle-class Manitobans, when they get high or drunk, it's in a private home. So by virtue of that, this law will never apply to you. You will never have to deal with this. The police will never, ever see you or ever come into contact you. But if you are poor or homeless, and disproportionately Indigenous people are poor and homeless in Manitoba, you may not have the option of getting high or drunk in private, and you may have to do this in public, and you may have no place to go. So you will be disproportionately targeted by the police, and they will make disproportionate policing choices to use this law against those people in that community, and therefore overrepresentation of the BIPOC community in these sobering centers. So that's the problem here. The police have discretion. There's been long documented experience of police unevenly enforcing laws against marginalized people, and racial profiling is very much a thing. And what they may choose for one family, they may choose something completely different for another. And of course, if you are somebody who's homeless, you may be estranged from your family. Even if you do get a phone call at the sobering center as to finding somebody who is sober who can come pick you up, you may not have anybody in your life. So homeless people will be disproportionately affected where they can't call to get somebody to get them out of there. There's no way to review their detention. So they're going to get stuck in custody longer. And again, I can't repeat this enough, they haven't committed a crime. They haven't done anything wrong. When police come into contact with racialized communities more than other communities, by virtue of that and by virtue of exercising their discretion, it means that the BIPOC community will disproportionately feel the effects of this law versus other communities. And this law will be used as a weapon against them. They will be targeted, and homeless people, poor, marginalized, and BIPOC community will feel the brunt of this. Kinew is not even trying to hide that fact. He's saying the quiet part out loud. He's talking about the panic in the community over homelessness and the meth crisis, and that he wants the laws to clamp down on this. And that's what he's doing. And there are choices here. He could be investing in housing. He could be investing in wraparound supports. Instead of giving people a fair shot at a good life, it's easier for him just to send out the police, round up people in homeless encampments, than it is to actually do the work, invest in our Manitobans who need more help, who are struggling. But no, the easy and lazy political thing to do is just turn to the police and say, you deal with it. And so what this law does is it criminalizes homelessness. And obviously many people who are homeless may be living with addictions issues, but it's increasing the amount of time that they may be held in custody because for the simple fact that they have nowhere else to go to consume drugs or alcohol. So they're setting these Manitobans up to fail. The government's not investing in housing or supports, and instead we're actually making things worse. We're demonizing and criminalizing homeless people, and we're taking away their liberty. This is not what Manitobans want. This is not a solution. This is not what the NDP stands for. And if the PCs had done this same action, the Manitoba NDP would have been outraged. And this truly reflects how much the Manitoba NDP has lost its way. It's basically given up on any principles that it has. And I can't put too fine a point on it. This is a racist law which will have racist implications for Manitoba, and we are taking a huge step backwards. Manitoba, this isn't the change you voted for. Thank you for joining us for our 10th edition of The Ledge. We'd love to hear from you. We're on all social media channels, and you can check out our website at markwasiliu.ca, and you can reach us by email at mark@markwasiliumla.ca. Talk to you soon.